So we're going to focus on a lot of different things. I want to talk about managing forests and the interplay between managing forests and forest carbon and climate change. And then also I want to bring into it, I know folks at Lewis Creek Association have been interested in how do we manage for carbon and how do we manage for a changing climate and climate change mitigation while also within the current use program, the use value appraisal program, which is a really important tax abatement program that helps our lands be conserved and protected and also managed responsibly, we hope. And we think that, I know that we can do really great carbon focused management within current use. And I just want to touch on that a little bit as well. But just in the basics here, so the carbon cycle is basically, this is again, all this stuff is going to be a massive oversimplification of everything we're talking about. It's all really, really nuanced, so just bear with me, please. So the carbon cycle is, the cycle that really is the foundation of all life on our planet. So it's the way that plants fix aerial carbon through the process of photosynthesis and turn it into tissue. They turn it into sugars, they make it into stuff. It gets broken down, it becomes organic carbon, a complex carbon, and eventually that carbon is broken down by bacteria and a bunch of other stuff, respires into the air and becomes carbon gas again, right? So one of the interesting things to think about carbon, when we talk about carbon, a lot of times we're sucked into this idea of thinking about it as this like shapeless, like it's some sort of inert chemical that, we don't know what it looks like. In reality, carbon is like plant tissue. And not only is it just sort of inertly in the soil, but it also has function. So carbon in our soils is wildlife habitat for all the little things that make our world work, like fungi and invertebrates, salamanders, stuff like that, and a number of different other organisms, vertebrate organisms. And it also has helps our forests build soil and fertility that is then taken up into plant life and trees and ultimately animals. And it's also has hydrologic benefits and a whole bunch of other benefits. So it has substance, and it's much more than just sort of this inert chemical. And the way it interacts with all the organisms on Earth is really complex. So in Vermont, most of our carbon, and this is from forest inventory and analysis data from Vermont from 2017, only 33% of forest carbon in our forests is in living trees. So most of it is and only 28% of it is in living trees above ground. So the vast majority of it is in the soil and in dead trees and in below ground portions of trees. So that's really important to know as well. We always think about these trees are huge, and they must be holding all that carbon in the trunks of the trees, but that's actually not the case. So this is a really cool graphic from a 2019 paper or booklet really by Tony D'Amato and Paul Catanzaro that they call a forest succession and development clock. And if you'll bear with me, so this clock is showing a few different things. So it's really important that we separate the idea of carbon sequestration and the idea of carbon storage. So the rate at which a forest is sequestering carbon is the rate at which it's grabbing carbon out of the air. The rate at which a forest is storing carbon, or the amount of carbon stored in a forest, is the total carbon that's in there, that's fixed in there. And again, most of that is usually in the soils. So what you see here is, we don't need to worry about this yellow circle here. Let's start with this green one. So this green circle is showing the rate at which forests are sequestering carbon as they develop. So this is not trees, this is forests as systems. And it's showing that on this clock starting at year 0, and the darker this color green is, the more carbon that forest is sequestering. So, here at year 0, let's say it's after a clear cut, or let's say it's after some big disturbance event, it's sequestering very little carbon. Here at year 30 through really like year 70, year 80, is really, really intense carbon sequestration. And so that's when you have this young forest, it's growing really, really fast, and it's pulling a lot of carbon out of the air, right? Now, for a long time, this has been sort of a dog whistle to the forest, to the industrial forest management industry, because they're like, oh, don't we want to sequester carbon? Let's clear cut our forests. And then the young forests are going to grow really fast and they're going to pull all this carbon out of the air. That's great. So that can be good, but what that's not accounting for is the fact that we also really want to store a lot of carbon in our forests. And so for a variety of different reasons, when you clear cut a forest or when there's a large scale disturbance event, here at year 0, you are storing very little carbon. And that forest continues to store carbon as it develops here into the future. So as you can see, it's just adding carbon, adding carbon, adding carbon, adding carbon. And then a big large scale disturbance event comes along and a lot of that carbon is released. So it's important to know the difference between those two things. So while a young forest sequesters carbon very quickly, it's not necessarily storing as much carbon as an older forest. So this is a graphic that is really, really important. Oh, I'm just going to move this around. Oh, this is a graphic that's really, really important, and you're going to see it a lot. And the reason you're going to see it is because it's just sort of this is a paper from 2009 by Jared Nunnery and Bill Keaton. And what this illustrates is the amount of above ground carbon sequestered by forests based on different types of treatments. So a treatment is the way that we manage the forest. And as you can see here, this red line, which is a no management scenario, is in above ground carbon is sequestering the most carbon. And then you have all these other clear cut, high frequency, clear cut, low frequency, shelter wood. These are just different silvicultural techniques, ways that people manage forests that you don't need to know what these are. But what you do need to know is that here we go at a no management scenario, we have the most carbon being sequestered. What you need to understand what this graphic really means is a few different things. So number one, this is not total carbon in the system. This is carbon sequestered, not stored, and it's just above ground carbon. The other thing is that this is a model which assumes, number one, no natural disturbances. So natural disturbances are a pretty big deal in the forest. So this is assuming, though, just for the sake of comparison, no natural disturbances. Number two, constant climate, which we know we don't have. Number three, stable carbon storage, stable soil carbon storage. So it's not considering many of the qualitative variables, which also are going to lend a lot of complexity to when we think about how we manage our forests, nor is it considering stuff like the benefits of replacing, say, non-renewable resources with renewable resources from forests, or replacing non-local resources with local resources, stuff like that. So this is a really, really important graphic for you to understand, but you should also have some context for what that means. So as we think about this, why is it important to manage our forests so that they're sequestering and storing carbon? So climate change is really, really important, and it's an intrinsic and existential threat to so much stuff that we care about. But when most of us, in the forest management or the ecology related fields talk about climate change, we actually have started using the term global change. So global change is a term that's meant to reflect a larger idea of the volume of stressors and challenges that are posed across our landscape, which is certainly, climate change is a big one of those, but it's certainly not all of them. So global change is climate change plus all these other stressors, including the legacy of past land clearing and the way that forests have been mismanaged in the past and other ecosystems have been mismanaged, invasive exotic plants, animals, pests, pathogens, what are sometimes called biological invasions, ongoing forest loss, conversion, fragmentation into small pieces, pollution, environmental despoliation, global loss of biodiversity, mass extinction, stuff like this. And so this is a better reflection, rather than just thinking about climate change as because it's such a huge threat as being the only threat, thinking about a more holistic view of what we're really facing and what our ecosystems are really facing is really, really important. And so as we manage our forests, we need to manage them in a way that's not just, maximum carbon necessarily in every situation, although we need to manage them for more carbon sequestration and storage because we want to mitigate the climate change part of this equation. But we also have to manage forests which are adaptive, which are resilient, and which are able to cope with this massive array of stressors that are coming down the pike. So there's a whole bunch of different effects that climate change has on forests. It's going to alter our natural disturbance. It is altering our natural disturbance regimes, altering the suitable ranges for our native species of trees and animals. If basically what you can think about this is it's increasing stress, right? Because our trees aren't, as soon as their suitable ranges are altered, you know, sugar maple isn't all going to die here all at once. It's just going to become the climate here is just going to become less and less hospitable for it, which is going to be really, really stressful. And so you can think about this as sort of a volume of stress and then add to that all this other stuff. So we in sort of the ecological forest management community have traded the idea of stability, the idea that of a forest that resists change, for resilience. And this is a recognition of the fact that forests change, they have to change, they're changing all the time, right? And we want to manage forests that are able to change while remaining healthy. So in the long term, resilient forests are going to sequester and store more carbon because they're going to be buffered from large-scale disturbances and large-scale problems that are going to threaten their ability to function as ecosystems. So that's really, really important. From another resource by Tony D'Amato and Paul Cannizzaro from 2016, which is also really great, Increasing Forest Resiliency for an Uncertain Future. They lay out these 4 goals. So goal number 1, keep forests forested and connected. Goal number 2, reduce stressors, limit the amount of stress that forests face in order to increase forest vigor. Goal number 3, reduce vulnerability. So make forests more resilient by establishing complex structure. We're going to talk about what that means, and reducing forest disturbances. Goal number 4, provide refuge. So maintain plant and animal diversity over time. So in addition to managing forests which are resilient, we also need to manage forests which are adaptive. So, you know, I'm sort of like obsessed with old growth forests. I love that they show us, you know, how forests are supposed to grow, because so many of our forests across our landscape are so altered. But you have to sort of take that with a grain of salt, because the environment, the conditions that in the world that we're managing our forests for now, the forest of the future is going to be entirely different than the forest of 300 years ago, because our climate is so altered and our world is so altered. So we want to manage forests which are able to adapt to and change in a wide variety of potential future conditions. And what this looks like, same thing as managing for resilient forests, what this means is we want to maintain a lot of diversity. So we want a diversity of different species, we want a diversity of different sizes and ages of trees, and we want to manage stressors across our landscape. So I figured I'd put in a picture of a stream because Lewis Creek Association's somewhat stream focused. I know much broader than that. But I think about sometimes the role of potential management being a carbon asset as, you know, I attended a meeting years ago, of stream folks, and they were talking about helping streams achieve a state of equilibrium. So streams that have been ditched and straightened, you want them to be able to restore their natural meanders. And in that state, they're going to be more stable, more resilient, less erosive, because they will sort of just be more in this resilient condition. Forests can be a little bit like that. So there may be conditions where, in order to manage our forests for an uncertain future, to actively make them more diverse and more resilient sooner than they'd be able to naturally, that we need to do some management. That management leads to the release of carbon, just like this stream restoring its natural meanders leads to a little bit of erosion, in order to get into a condition that's going to buffer it from large-scale disturbances and large-scale releases of carbon in the future. It's not something that we need to do on every acre, but it is something that can have some benefits to our forests, which our climate is changing so much faster that we may need to help our forests adapt to these conditions because they can't respond to them fast enough on their own. The other thing that we need to think about is that, you know, when you start thinking about like how scary climate change is and what an existential threat it is to our ecosystems and all the things we care about, it's easy to lose track of the quality. So the quantity is carbon. So forests can sequester and store a lot of carbon. The quality is the goal of mitigating climate change and the goal of protecting our planet is not just to, you know, mitigate this one thing. We want to create a world which is more functional, right? We want ecological integrity. We want wildlife habitat. And at the same time that our ecosystems are under this tremendous amount of stress, so are the non-tree biological organisms that are associated with them, right? So we need to be thinking about managing across our landscape for not just carbon, but also all the things. So all the habitats, all of the species, and our biodiversity, which is so important to us. So biodiversity is something that is precious. It is severely threatened by global change. And when you look at the statistics about where we are, we're in the middle of a mass extinction event. Where we are with biodiversity, it's sobering, right? So according to some sources, 1 million animal and plant species are now threatened with extinction. More than 40% of our amphibians, a third of our reef-forming corals, a third of our marine mammals are threatened. We've lost like, I think it's 680 vertebrate species in the last 300 years, and perhaps as many as 100,000 invertebrate species. We don't really know. So biodiversity is important because organisms have the right to exist. They have intrinsic importance, I would argue. And it's important because biodiversity, that diversity, remember, is the tool that allows our forests to be resilient and to be adaptive in a changing climate. Protecting biodiversity may require us to use tools that don't necessarily optimize forest carbon. So an example of that is we have this incredibly altered landscape. We don't have the diversity of habitats across our landscape that we would have had prior to European colonization. They just haven't had time to develop. And so if we want to protect communities of organisms, we may need to create those habitats actively. And, you know, in the case of like creating a pocket of young forest, that is not a strategy that's going to sequester a lot of carbon, but it might, and in fact, it is going to cause the release of carbon, but it might be something that we want to do to protect our biodiversity, which is, again, not a quantitative benefit, but a qualitative benefit. I would argue also, though, that it has feedbacks into our ability to sequester and store carbon because our biodiversity is what keeps our ecosystems chugging. And our ecosystems chugging along, in the case of Vermont, our forests are going to, you know, if we have healthy, diverse ecosystems, they're going to be more able to sequester and store carbon into the future. Okay, so total left-hand turn. Now we're talking about a government program called the Use Value Appraisal, UVA, or current use. This is, a lot of us county foresters, this is what we spend like most of our time on because it's a really, really important program. So it's a tax abatement program for forested and agricultural lands in Vermont. Here's some excerpts from the UVA manual. Basically, if you're in the forested part of this program, you need 25 acres. You need a forest management plan developed by a licensed professional forester, which is reviewed by the county forester, me, in the case of Chittenden County, who also monitors it, and you got to follow the plan. And in exchange, you get, essentially, you pay less taxes on that land because it's being assessed at not its full fair market value, but its use value. The benefit of this is that we hope that it lowers tax pressure on landowners so people aren't being taxed off their land, and that land is, it's decreasing subdivision and development pressure, and that land is being managed better because it's being managed with a professional approach. And, you know, held to certain standards and subject to some review by the county foresters. So what it says about forest management is, while many different landowner objectives may be achieved through active forest management, production of high quality forest products on a sustainable basis shall be the primary focus of management efforts on all enrolled parcels of forest land. That's from the UVA manual. There are exceptions to this. So exceptions to this are the ESTAs, what we call, their full name is the ecologically significant treatment areas, which are managed for not forest products, but for water quality, wildlife habitat, and other non-commercial benefits. And some of the ESTAs that are eligible for in the current use program include natural communities of statewide significance, so rare natural communities, rare, threatened, and endangered species, riparian areas, so areas that are adjacent to, that have some water quality benefit, that are adjacent to water, surface waters, vernal pools, forested wetlands, and old forests. The old forest thing is pretty weird, and we can talk about it later. But basically, that's not for an area that right now, that's not for an area that you can just put land in it and let it become old forest. It's in recognition of a forest that's already old. So we can talk about that later in the questions if you want. Managing for, quote, high quality forest products can be completely compatible with managing for forest carbon. And actually within most forest carbon markets, there's a series of practices that's called improved forest management, or IFM, which is allowed within these practices. It doesn't mean that every tree on your forest needs to get harvested, or that, when it gets to be a certain age, or that everything is getting clear cut. It just means that the land needs to be actively managed in some way, in a way that's ostensibly for the current or future production of forest products. So an example of how forest management cannot be like the forest management of your nightmares is through practices like ecological forest management. So ecological forestry is the radical idea, I put radical in air quotes, that we manage forests like they manage themselves, right? That we're recognizing that they have intrinsic importance, and we're managing them as complex systems, not just as like tree farms, although, sometimes we'll call them tree farms, but managing them as complex systems which are not limited to trees, right? So it's this whole volume of life, not just like I'm growing this tree to be a saw timber, a stick of saw timber, and when it gets to be 18 inches in diameter, I'm going to cut it and send it to the mill. It's a much more holistic approach. And it's recognizing the importance of not just trees, but all the organisms and all the natural processes that make forests work. So how we can manage for forest carbon in an individual forest, we can do a bunch of different things. So one thing is increasing rotation age, so letting trees get older. Leaving big trees. So in the work that I do, I leave lots of what I call biological legacy trees, or legacy trees, which are ostensibly just, they're trees that are being managed not for timber, that are allowed to become big and old and confer to the forest the many ecological benefits of being big trees, and eventually to be big dead trees. We're leaving tons of dead wood on the forest floor, and trying to increase the resiliency and the adaptability of those systems. So again, recognizing that the sequestration and storage ability of a forest hinges on its ability to be resilient and its ability to be adaptive. And if we can do forest management that is increasing diversity and complexity, so doing stuff like supporting a healthy mix of different species, supporting multi-aged forests which are more like old growth forests, in that they're not just all trees that are the same age, but are more complex and diverse, that have structural diversity, and by addressing forest health threats like invasive plants, deer overpopulation, stuff like that. Those are all things that are going to help our forests sequester and store lots of carbon in the long term. The other thing that we can do is avoid larger canopy openings, like big clear cuts, except in case we're trying to create some like very particular wildlife habitat that is not appropriate in every situation, but may be appropriate in certain situations for certain species. So one of the things that we can do by managing in this way, and by keeping those structures, longer rotations, leaving big trees, leaving dead trees, leaving dead wood on the forest floor, is that we can capture many of the ecological indicator species which are associated with old growth forests, which are these incredible repositories of biodiversity, right? So we can't create old growth forests, but we can make our forests old growthier. And we can look to old growth forests for lessons for how we manage our forests, so that we're really trying to capture the whole diverse range of different organisms that are utilizing these areas, and also hopefully their ability to sequester and store carbon and to mitigate the many stressors of climate change. So if you look into the literature, what you see is that there's these ecological indicator species that are associated with old growth. They include salamanders, which are largely associated with dead wood and with gaps in the forest canopy, mosses, lichens, other bryophytes, liverworts. They're associated with dead wood, big old trees, smaller rather than larger canopy openings. Bark foraging birds like brown creeper and our nuthatches are associated with big old trees that have complex bark and complex canopies that they can forage for the tiny little invertebrates that they hunt for. Bird species diversity, so managing for different sizes, ages, and species of tree is going to capture a huge volume of different ecological niches which are occupied by a wide range of our different native birds. And fungi, commonly associated with these old growth forests. If we're leaving dead wood, which is habitat for fungi, and also big old trees, which have been shown to serve as hubs and these underground, wood wide web, these underground fungal networks that are connecting trees, helping them extract resources from their environment, and also sometimes passing communication signals and stuff like that between them. We can capture, we can't make old growth forests, but we can capture many of the benefits of old growth forests and their attendant biodiversity by managing our forests in a slightly different way. So I think, managing our forest carbon across the landscape, by far, I would say a bigger threat to our forests, especially where I am, a bigger threat to our forests than climate change is forest loss. So Vermont loses 1,500 acres of forest a year, we think, mostly to development. And why that's scarier than climate change in some respects is that every one of those acres will never sequester and store carbon again. So that is, it'll never provide wildlife habitat, and it may diminish the ability of wildlife to access certain habitats as it fragments our landscape. And that's pretty much permanent. And so avoiding deforestation, forest fragmentation, parcelization through conservation and smart planning and zoning, it doesn't mean that we can't build any more houses, but it may mean that we need to really think about where we put them and clustering them in areas that are already developed and already fragmented, increasing the density with which we're developing in our communities, and avoiding developing in larger forested blocks is really, really important. And so as we're thinking about, broadening, so managing for landscapes that are going to store a lot of carbon and also that are ecologically healthy in a broader sense, we need to think about managing young forests, young simple forests, which is most forests on our landscape, to be more resilient, diverse, and complex. Creating pockets perhaps of habitat underrepresented across our landscape in order to protect our native biodiversity, which is going to be under and is under so much stress. Allowing some forests to be unmanaged. So if anyone tells you that the concept of a forest being unmanaged is an existential threat to forest management, they're just not being creative, right? Because almost every one of us who loves forests and believes in forest management also believes strongly in the idea of protecting unmanaged forests across our landscape. We love them. We want them to be here. That's really, really important. At the same time, that it doesn't answer all of our questions. It doesn't provide all the things that we need, but it provides a bunch of them that are really, really important that cannot be ignored. And also addressing landscape level threats like invasive exotic plants, insects, pests, pathogens, deer overpopulation, forest loss, conversion, fragmentation, parcelization, and who knows what else coming down the pike. So we need to make our land, in addition to making our forests more resilient, we need to make our landscapes more resilient and functional. And the last thing I'll say, this is like the weirdest thing, but thinking about, challenging all of us to think about where our resources come from. And if we're saying, we don't like forest management, we don't like resource production in our communities, but we're still consuming resources, think about where those resources are coming from. I think it is radical to think about local renewable resources. So those are resources that are produced in our communities which we have control over their environmental and social impacts, rather than saying not in my backyard and just displacing the effects of our resource consumption on people who don't have the privilege to say that. And those resources, when they finally make their way to you, may have been produced with social and ecological side effects that you wouldn't be comfortable with in your community. And so there's this thing where, forest management makes a lot of people really uncomfortable, but thinking about if this is something that we need to do to build a better world is really think critically about where our resources come from. And if they're local and if they're renewable and if they make us uncomfortable, isn't that better than having no idea where they come from, and potentially having all of these other impacts? And I can get more into that, but I won't get too far into the weeds. But I think that, it's really important to protect our communities and the unique ecology that we have here. But it's also really, really, really important that we broaden our focus and that we really think about how we're affecting the world with our resource consumption, especially. And doing, something that's a little bit uncomfortable here may be the lesser of two evils, if it means protecting an ecosystem, protecting a people somewhere else in the world. So here's a few resources that are really great. These are all by, I was realizing this as I was putting this together, these are all by Tony D'Amato and Paul Catanzaro. They're just really good at, Tony's just like an amazing resource to our community here in Vermont. He's at UVM. And both Tony and Paul are just like so good at distilling really complex concepts into simple and understandable language. And so that's why I love recommending those resources to other people.